This lecture has been made available to you courtesy of the American Numismatic Society.
So I will be more than happy to take this moment to introduce our guest speaker today, Rory Naismith. And I'm very pleased that he was able to join us today for this long table. Rory is professor of early medieval English history and is a fellow at Corpus Christi College in Cambridge. And in fact, he did his undergraduate and postgraduate work at Trinity College in Cambridge. So he's been there and has come back. Some of his postgraduate or postdoctoral work was also at the Fitzwilliam Museum, where he did quite a bit of work on coinage in the collection there, and in fact has published extensively on parts of the Fitzwilliam collection in a number of volumes on coinage of the British Isle, various siliges, and also on has published on Anglo-Saxon history in general. His publication list is quite extensive and includes 2 prize-winning books, one of which is Money and Power in Anglo-Saxon England, which was published by Cambridge in 2012 and won the 2013 International Society of Anglo-Saxonists First Book Prize. And he's also published more recently, Making Money in Early Medieval or in Early Middle Ages, the book we will be talking about today, which quite rightly won the 2025 Otto Grünler Book Prize. And in fact, I'm not a medievalist at all, as many of you know, but I've found this book to be very stimulating and very interesting. And in fact, for thinking a great deal about archaic coinage and the world in which this coinage came to be. In fact, I've really found this book to be very useful for thinking about archaic coinage, but this is something we can talk a little bit about later on, but at this moment, I'll be happy to turn it over to Professor Naismith. So all yours, Rory.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter, for such a kind and generous introduction. And thank you to all of you for turning out this fine, I would say this fine evening. It's probably sort of lunchtime, maybe even late morning, wherever you guys are. And as Peter said, I wrote this book a little while ago, Making Money in the Early Middle Ages, with the same title as I'm talking about today. I think the advertising picture for this was also the cover of the book, which features 2 very nice coins from the ANS collection. And yeah, what I'm going to talk about today gives you some of the highlights from the questions I was trying to answer in this book. Now, early medieval money, if I can get my PowerPoint up to show you some pretty pictures. There we go. Okay. Can everyone see that? Could someone give me a thumbs up? There we go. There's a lovely. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so early medieval money has had a bad rap. It plays the role of feeble and primitive foil to the dynamic monetary economies of the Roman period on one side and of the commercial revolution of the 13th century on the other. And in many ways, that poor reputation is understandable. In the period between the end of the Roman Empire in Western Europe in the 5th century and the 12th century, there was a lot less money around in terms of circulating coin. That is the conclusion drawn by historians, archaeologists, numismatists working across much of the former Western Roman Empire, and it is pretty inescapable. At the archaeological site of San Genesio in Pisa, where about 2,000 square meters have recently been excavated, some 240 Roman coins were found, and 170 from the late 12th century and after, compared with 2 from the early Middle Ages. Similar figures could be cited from across Italy and France. The change can be quantified on an even larger scale for England and Wales, where the portable antiquities scheme exists. This is a scheme that logs coins and other objects found by amateur metal detector users. And so this is only as comprehensive as the energy and goodwill of finders allow, but it provides a good guide to the big picture. Crucially, it focuses on single finds, thought to have been lost individually and not on hoards that were buried together. And if one compares the total numbers of coins found from the Roman period, from the early Middle Ages, and from the later Middle Ages, on the portal antiquities scheme, and taking the later Middle Ages as running down to 1500, the figures speak loudly and clearly. And here you can see them. People lost an average of nearly 700 recorded coins per year across the Roman period, and 177 per year in the later Middle Ages, while for the early Middle Ages, the figure is under 9, fewer than the equivalent of 9 recorded fines of coins per year from the 5th to the 11th centuries, and these are heavily concentrated in the decades around the year 700 and then from after about 950. This is not a promising start, and we go from bad to worse on turning to the versatility of early medieval currency. Roman coinage included a large base metal element that served as small change, and there were also low-value silver and bullion coins in the later Middle Ages. That was generally not the case in the early Middle Ages. In the 5th to the 7th centuries, gold coins reigned supreme, preserving the top end of the denominational structure of the later Roman Empire, but no longer consistently supported by lower value components of copper alloy and silver. Silver came back onto the menu from the late 7th century when silver pennies took over the mantle of the dominant denomination and gradually spread to become the main currency everywhere from Rome to Barcelona, Budapest, Dublin, and Sweden. These were somewhat lower in value, the gold-silver ratio being typically about 12 or 14 to 1, but they were still far from low value in absolute terms. Charlemagne, in 794, stipulated the maximum prices that could be charged for bread made from various different kinds of grain, and for a £2 wheat loaf, the maximum that could be charged for a dozen £2 wheat loaves, the maximum that could be charged was 1 penny. This was not quite a mono-denominational currency. There were small numbers of halfpennies, or obols as they were known in the Carolingian world, and there were even smaller numbers of large gold coins, but it was narrowly focused on a mid-value denomination, using those bread prices in very rough terms. We're talking about tens of dollars or pounds or euros in each individual silver piece. So people just had to spend their pennies as best they could, be they inconveniently high in value for the poor or inconveniently low in value for the wealthy. So all of this provides my point of departure. What I'm interested in is in taking the issue in a slightly different direction. Yes, the scale of coined money was limited, but there were always some coins being made and always some coins being used in most of early medieval Western Europe. The question is, at a time when people must have been comfortable doing without coined money, and it was often not easy to come by, why did they make or use it at all? What kind of pressures, desires, or situations prompted them to turn to coined money, and with what associations or effects? I believe that what emerges in the early Middle Ages is a very interesting kind of monetary economy, one that was functionally diverse, yet still embedded in many kinds of social relation, taking advantage of a consistent yet constrained currency. Coins became a way of reifying value, pinning it down, in any setting where what was being handed over, often in a public or performative way, was meaningful, regardless of whether it was a purchase, a rent, a gift, or whatever. At the same time, there were deep tensions created by coined money because of imbalances in access and distribution. This was most pronounced at the point of production. Circulation could work rather differently and be a good indicator of economic complexity, with implications about the nature of economic demand. In what follows, I'll go through some of the major patterns that can be seen in relation to the making and use of coins. But one first preliminary issue before we get there. And I should apologize because, of course, we're all numismatists, we all love coins, but money is not just coin. It is most fundamentally a consensus on measuring value, or even just measuring obligation, that's manifested in common units of account. In this conceptual sense, virtually all of early medieval Europe was highly monetized, including places like pre-Viking Ireland or 10th century northern Iberia, where hardly any coins circulated. This is an important point not to lose sight of. Most people were accustomed to thinking in quantitative monetary terms, even if they did not count out actual coins. One consequence of this is that when charters or narratives from this period mention, say, a denarius, standard word for the basic silver coin in Latin, it is often difficult to tell whether they mean an actual silver coin or just a measure of value equivalent to one. Another consequence is that we need to be very careful of dismissing periods or societies because coin was scarce. You could, in early medieval Europe, have relatively complex economic systems, even highly commercial ones, with minimal coined money. The opposite, lots of coins without complex exchange systems, is also theoretically possible, but, as we'll see, less likely in practice. One other consequence of this is that we need to be cautious in using the term monetization. It can mean two things. One is what I've just described, the general spread of thought in terms of money. Another, the one economic historians usually have in mind, is use of actual coin, use of actual specie. Monetization of this kind has often been deployed as a blunt instrument, which Michael Poston diagnosed as an analytical deus ex machina that could be invoked to explain whatever a historian wanted. If the straitened early Middle Ages can teach scholars of monetary history one thing, it is that you could have plenty of quantification and monetary thought without much coin. And also that coined money did not just happen on its own, did not just happen organically. It emerges from specific circumstances and different segments of society engaged with it in their own distinct ways. So, today, I'll focus largely on the actual coined money, with particular reference to why coins were made and why coins were used under these circumstances. These two parts of a coin's lifespan may have had little, if any, direct connection, and they served quite different economic roles. To try and distinguish them, I'll refer to anything that directly caused or resulted from production of coin as primary circulation, and all use subsequent to that as secondary circulation. There is a significant schematic element here. I'm going to be looking at the broader picture and larger models, which I will situate with reference to specific examples, but with the general caveat that large patterns always had their own local texture and certain exceptions. Right then, making coins. It's actually very difficult to pinpoint why coins were made, a fact that applies even in antiquity and the later Middle Ages. As the points about conceptual money highlight, coins were not really needed, but they were invested with strong symbolic resonances, and they were desirable and convenient for certain constituencies and purposes. These generally revolved around state structures, elites, or both. Broader commercial demand may have been a major factor in the later Middle Ages, but probably not in most cases before the 12th century. For analytical purposes, it's possible to propose three relevant models, one in which coins were made for state expenditure, one in which coins were made for state income, and one in which coins were made in a more personalized, localized, and direct interchange of needs on the part of people with significant resources, basically elites. So the first of these, state expenditure, means a situation in which most coins were made and put into circulation through direct and usually fairly centralized state action. It is the classic model for big polities with taxes and salaries for at least some of the army or bureaucracy. The later Roman Empire, from around 300 to 500, is a good example, though so too is its later Byzantine incarnation, as well as many Islamic states. In the Roman case, the cycle begins with coins being made for paying soldiers and officials. These would then percolate out into wider circulation, and some would be sucked back in by the imperial administration when taxes in cash were demanded. Those taxes would then be consolidated and passed on to a select few centres for reminting alongside fresh bullion from mines, at which point the cycle would begin again. I'm simplifying a bit here, but consensus still seems to be that something like this scheme was at work. Elements of it are mentioned in various pieces of legislation collected together under Theodosius II and then under Justinian, and also occasionally in narrative texts. There are well-known passages in John Lydus and in Procopius about the dire consequences of the imperial postal service being scaled back in Anatolia, with the consequence that landowners could no longer sell their crops to representatives of the state to get the gold they needed to pay their taxes. The whole situation was bad and left both the imperial administration and its subjects suffering. Behind this lay what was clearly a large and structured administrative machinery. There were normally only about a dozen or fewer places minting coins in the whole empire. All represented large quasi-industrial operations, and their distribution depended more on administrative geography than commerce or population. The rich provinces of Egypt and North Africa were generally without mints, for example, while the four clustered around the Sea of Marmara represent the confluence of four different provinces. The number of mints was even smaller for gold coinage, which from the late 4th century was often made at just one place within each emperor's territory. Tellingly, gold and silver fell under the jurisdiction of a separate section of the Roman bureaucracy to the base metal coinage. Gold was by far the most important, the most prestigious element of the currency. Figures of any status received payments in the form of gold coins and silver plate, as did the mass of the army at occasional payments known as donatives. Some, but by no means all, late Roman gold coins carried inscriptions saying that they were made specifically for distribution in these circumstances. Much later, Luitprand of Cremona described a ceremonial distribution of salaries to 10th century Byzantine officials, in which gold pieces in sealed sacks were given out in the presence of the emperor. Something similar was done with gold dinars in Fatimid Cairo. These were offerings that sat somewhere on a continuum between payment and gift, with a high degree of ceremonial essential to their first transfer from rulers to valued subjects. Neither Luitprand nor the Fatimid or late Roman sources specifically say that coins given out in this way were freshly minted, but given the context, it is entirely plausible, I'd argue quite likely, that they were. It is worth stressing that ritualized contexts like these may have been a major cause for making high-value coins. There was not necessarily a more mundane monetary economy lurking behind the scenes. Ritual, economy, and the state were closely intertwined. Now, that is not to say that state taxes and payouts dominated without exception. A set of laws from the 360s and 370s shows that some people had been trying to use minting facilities to get their own private gold turned into solidi, which was the main gold denomination at the time. At first, the emperor flat out refused for them to do this. But a few years later, he relented and allowed minting to go ahead with a hefty rate of 25% of the gold going into the state coffers. The importance of this is that it implies demand for minting for private purposes, which foreshadows the more direct role of local elites in minting that would be important in later times. And this brings us to the second major kind of relationship between minting and the rest of society, characterized by what I'll call state income. Here, the state and its fiscal processes remained the major force behind minting, but the onus fell on those who owed payments to the state. So that instead of having mints apparently handling coins for expenditure, they instead mostly focused on coins for state income. A model of this kind tended to be found in polities with a firm idea of fiscal extraction as a right or power on the Roman model, but an increasingly limited role for that resource as an actual prop of government. That is to say, there tended to be some sort of taxation system, but not a standing salaried army, not something the state actually paid out these coins to in the same way. Another important change is that regions where state income was a key force in minting typically had more numerous mint places, which hints at the dynamic behind this shift. Collection and transformation of income became a desirable thing, typically in the hands of local elites, who might well also be representatives of the state. More fragmented minting therefore reflects a changing nexus between local society, coined money, and state authority. My chosen example here is Merovingian Gaul between the late 6th century and about 751. It had at first a large coinage of gold tremises, replaced around 670 with silver denarii. Both are known from vast numbers of mint places, especially the gold, for which at least 600 identifiable mints have been noted, with many more that cannot be localized, and new ones turning up on a regular basis. So this map you see, covered very healthily with dots, is probably a minimal picture. Although, of course, not all of them would have worked at one time. And these profuse mints were highly diverse in character. Some were cities, generally the big ones, but most of the mint places were called vicus, meaning rural settlements that sat at the center of a local district. Jean-François Boyer has recently showed that many Merovingian Vici mints were central places in structures of local power, and some of them re-emerge as centers of districts in later times, or were among the properties of elites mentioned in wills or other documents, such as Ardin, which belonged to the Bishop of Le Mans. Very little about these coins indicates why they were actually made. In many ways, they are resolutely local. Hardly any of them name the king. The norm was to give the name of the location and of the craftsman official responsible for manufacture, known as the moneyer. A few specify that they were made for what they call ratio ecclesiae, or something like that, meaning the tax account of the church. This is one hint that, at least in principle, the fiscal machinery of the kingdom played a part in calling these mint places into being. The only detailed account of how this might work in practice is a contentious passage in the life of Saint Eligius, patron saint of moneyers, who was a 7th century bishop of Paris, who also served as a moneyer and goldsmith earlier in his life. It describes how a tax collector and a moneyer, it's not exactly clear whether these are one and the same person or two individuals, arrive to exact what's called the census publicus, the general land tax from the districts, what they call the pagus, around Solignac, which is near Limoges in central France. And this is a place where Eligius owned the local estate. The people who lived on that land produced a mass of gold to settle this payment, but the miraculous element in the story was that this gold would not melt until Eligius himself shows up, and then it cooperates, it does melt down. Now, whether that means the tax itself should have gone to him, or just the right to gather and process it, is not clear either. What can be said is that by this stage, the taking of tax involved gold coin, but was extracted on a very local basis, with an expectation that local elites might play a significant role in the process. We can turn all of this back onto the eye-popping map of Merovingian mint places and recognize that most of these would operate only briefly and occasionally. It also makes sense of a surprising feature of Merovingian coinage, which is that even coins from small, apparently short-lived mint places would commonly circulate far across Francia, and payment of tax is one plausible explanation for this. The murkiest part of the story is what happened next. The Merovingian kings did not regularly pay out money to an army or network of bureaucrats, so the best guess is that their gold income was spent in other ways, on the royal household or on gifts to supporters and churches. Of course, this all assumes that everything minted in the localities made it to the king. A big part of the success of the Merovingian monetary system was how its basic structures could be adapted to suit various interests. Local elites might seek immunity from the financial demands and jurisdictional interference of royal government. And because the king no longer needs the income in quite the same way as his Roman predecessors had done, he was more willing to grant that to favoured individuals. But elites might equally buy enthusiastically into the raising of tax because it offered obvious potential for both peculation and dialogue with the king. So Gregory of Tours, for example, the major historian of Gaul writing at the end of the 6th century, has several stories that revolve around people basically hiving off money from local taxes. He's got one about how the count and his deputy at the city of Tours got into difficulties after borrowing against the future income they were expecting to get from the taxes. For this reason, I am very hesitant to see the Merovingian coinage as evidence of a robust fiscal machine. It may have started out that way, but its persistence and success indicate local agencies buying into it for their own benefit. It is likely that by an early stage, only a limited proportion of the coins from each act of minting actually reach the king. Some whole coinages, for instance in areas covered by immunities, may never even have been intended for sending to the king at all. And this final possibility brings us to the third of my models for how and why coins were made in early medieval Europe. One in which minting is still driven by direct interaction with patrons, but the demands of a centralized state recede and are replaced, or at least outnumbered, by more localized, personalized ones. Mints and moneyers might still have operated in the name of a king and may well have paid some sort of fee or proportion of profits to that king, but the key point is that the bulk of minting was no longer tied to either expenditure or income of a larger state structure. Some production might be driven by occasional recoinages, and some might stem from large-scale commodified movements of bullion, which tended to feed the major mint places and hubs of long-distance or cross-border exchange, such as Carolingian Dorstad or late Anglo-Saxon London. But even in both these scenarios, production came to depend more closely on private demand. Another way of putting this is that the primary circulation of coin became based on what had previously been the domain of secondary circulation, the two collapsing together. Coins would have been made for commercial activities, for the payment of rents, for the giving of gifts, and so on. The puzzle is when and why people would actually make new coins to do the job that old ones could do perfectly well. Again, it is not enough just to think that coins are generally pretty, or good, or desirable. There needs to be some sort of need to mobilize the not insignificant resources that minting required, something that needed coins specifically rather than just plate or other commodities. We need therefore to think in this scenario not just of economic imperatives, but social and cultural ones. This is partly a function of the small scale of the early medieval monetary economy, because they just don't need coins in the same volume, so there's a wider range of demands leading to their production. But it also reflects the dynamics of minting on this model. Production was relatively dispersed and dominated by elites, both in terms of jurisdiction and in terms of patronage, that is, who actually brought in the gold or silver that fueled most minting. Elites were likely the ones who kept most production of coin afloat, with larger and more predictable demand. Moneyers and mints could well have made coin for others as well, but they are likely to have done so on the back of elite demand. That was their bread and butter. And so I'll illustrate this with an example from Carolingian Francia. The passage on the slide you see here comes from one of the first written grants of minting privileges, which was issued by King Charles the Bald, who was the grandson of Charlemagne, in favour of the Cathedral of Châlons-en-Champagne in 865. It says that the church has been given this right to make its own coin because they could not otherwise obtain coins without considerable trouble. The implication is that, at least as far as Charles and the bishop believed, establishing a mint in Châlons would enable them to create coins for their own needs whenever required. Elsewhere, it is possible to see that such needs might include gifts, rents, land purchases, and commerce, all of which could drive minting. The underlying problem in Carolingian Francia, in late Anglo-Saxon England, 10th and 11th century Germany and Italy, is that virtually never does anyone say why specific batches of coin were made. At best, it is assumed that moneyers were there to supply coin if it was needed and couldn't be sourced through other channels. As at Châlons, this is in fact the reasoning given in some Carolingian and German diplomas, charters for setting up a mint in the first place. These are the three general schemes for how and why I think coins were made. They were not mutually exclusive. A degree of elite demand existed already in the late Roman period. Some coin issues in Merovingian Francia, Visigothic Iberia, and elsewhere probably represent royal expenditure for specific and substantial needs, like one-off army payments. And in Carolingian Francia and late Anglo-Saxon England, pressures that pulled patrons to mint coins sometimes included royally mandated tributes to Viking invaders. The point is to emphasize the prevailing source of demand. The main caveat, however, is that all three of these models look only at a part of the lifespan of coins in circulation. Production and the steps that immediately preceded or followed, or primary circulation, leaving to one side everything that came next, or secondary circulation, which brings us then to the essential tensions in the monetary system of the period. The basic problem is one we've already met, the relatively restricted size and versatility of the monetary system. But what follows from this, even if it is less immediately obvious, is that the limited resources would have been distributed very unevenly. Elites dominated production and primary circulation and sat on comparatively large reserves of cash. Indirectly, they therefore played a large role in the shape of secondary circulation too. All of this meant that the bulk of the population had an even smaller pool of coin to use, and because dealing in cash often meant dealing with the elite or their close allies, they entered at a significant disadvantage. In the year 829, a gathering of bishops at Paris expressed concern at this and other problems that beset the rural economy. They lamented how both ecclesiastical and secular lords would beat anyone who refused to accept their prices at market. They complained about tactics used to exploit desperate peasants during famines. For instance, selling stockpiles of grain at the current highly inflated price, and then asking the peasant to pay back the same amount of money at harvest time when the price of grain had plummeted. So in other words, they need to hand over about 4 times as much grain to produce the same price. There is little doubt that tactics like these were commonplace in the early Middle Ages, yet they are rarely confronted as directly as they are at this council. That is partly because the emphasis generally fell on coin as an expression of solidarity or even equity. As Jonas of Orleans, who wrote up the decrees of the Council of Paris in 829, put it, lords and peasants should be able to engage smoothly in what he called the willing compact of buyer and seller. He does not explicitly refer to coin in this, but coin would certainly fit very well into these roles. To use coin was to participate in what was conceived of as a grand consensus, one that united the people within a whole given kingdom. This was why moralizing rulers like Charlemagne, Louis the Pious, Edgar the Peaceable, and Ethelred the Unready reformed their coinages as a demonstrative statement of cleansing and restoring that could be seen and appreciated by the whole populace. It's not primarily about actually drumming up money. Reforming the coin and reminting all of it, at least ostensibly, had this as its main aim. And this was also why, on a much smaller scale, people made a point of using coins in exchanges with a public and performative character. In such settings, coins provided a metonym for value that everyone could see and understand. They were used in rituals of both manumission and autodidition. That is to say, both setting someone free from slavery and selling yourself into slavery, for example. A wonderful illustration of the valence of handing over coin comes from a Tuscan document, what's called a placitum, a record from a legal meeting in 803. It concerns a priest called Alpulo who risked everything to be with a nun called Gumperga. At one point in the account of the case that was given by Alpulo, Gumperga had been taken from the priest's house back to her nunnery. But the amorous priest was not to be stopped. In the night, he rode to the nunnery and met Gumperga at what must have been a pre-planned rendezvous. A wonderfully vivid touch is that Alpulo had to stand up on his horse to lift Gumperga over the wall. And this is where the romance comes in, if you choose to call it that, and I choose to imagine it looking something like this. Alpulo kissed Gumperga and handed her a few coins, 2 solidi, which he described as an ara, or pledge, meaning a statement of intent to marry. The priest then rode off again, perhaps warmed by an inner glow, though in the event neither party was to have the time of their life. Alpulo's 2 appeals against an unfavourable judgment were upheld, and as far as we know, he and Gumperga were never to be reunited. So using coin could, therefore, be both assertive and emancipatory, but also coercive and exploitative. Crucially, monetary transactions were backed up with the full weight of legal and social structures. No hard incentive attached to using coins except insofar as they were demanded by parties able to assert their will. But there was most definitely a penalty for refusing them when they were offered. This was typically, the penalty for this was typically a fine or a public beating, according to some Carolingian capitularies. One short text issued by the Frankish king Charles the Bald in 861 dealt with a specific incident of people refusing good coin, though frustratingly it doesn't say where this happened, and it gives instructions for the officials that Charles sent out to deal with this affront. They were to be merciful and take into account factors like hardship, status, and even gender. And the capitulary indicates that low status women may have been the culprits. Nonetheless, repeat offenders would be punished by being burned in the face with the coins that they had rejected. They'd be heated up and then branded on the forehead. The refusal of coin that Charles and his men were so keen to nip in the bud was probably less a judgment on the quality of Charles's coinage, though at this stage it was very inconsistent, and more a sign of the unequal and disadvantageous interactions that coin involved. Challenging the reliability of the coins themselves, which this text suggests was a strategy used by groups below the elite, was one of very few options left open. We should be in no doubt that money and access to it was some of the variables that resulted from and played into subtle social differentiations. Village-level elites who had ties to external, higher elites and their social networks may well have been in touch with moneyers or mints, giving them a direct line to fresh coinage, and they could channel this to neighbours in a village setting or take advantage of it to enhance their spending power in markets or in buying land. A wide range of people would have had some contact with secondary circulation of coin, again, probably via markets, and here the level of involvement and access did not necessarily correlate with all other markers of rank or status. They could be uneven. Those with more land may have relied less on the market, while those with less land depended more on work as artisans or wage labourers, so may in fact have been relatively richer in cash and more dependent on using it. This could be seen as both a good thing and a bad thing. It reflects a higher level of economic complexity and a greater degree of autonomy, as Georg Simmel emphasized in relation to industrialized societies in the 19th century. But in a peasant context, market dependence may have been seen as second best, and it brought a high level of risk, reliant as it was on so many variables and on contact with diverse economic partners. There was interesting contact between spheres of primary and secondary circulation. Again, I'm using models that could apply in different ways, and will try to stress some of these potential variations as I go along. So, first of these models for how primary and secondary circulation might work. This is a situation, I'm thinking here of a situation in which the monetary medium was so small and so high in value that it had precious little circulation outside the elite, meaning that there would be hardly any progression of coin beyond primary circulation, beyond what happens immediately after the coins are made. Those without close connections to the milieu of monetary production would have used coin very rarely, if at all. Systems of this limited form would have been encountered most often in the period of dominance by gold, when finds of coin are few and suggestive of elite contexts. There would still have been some coin-based commerce for luxuries or in bulk, but other kinds of use would have played a relatively larger role in the circulation of coin, such as gift-giving, the payment of fines and taxes, and so forth. Importantly, larger state structures that involved but were still partially distinct from elite networks would have been a factor in the making and initial circulation of coin. Visigothic Iberia is one example of a system that probably worked like this in practice. Its gold tremises are usually viewed in the context of taxes being paid in and out of state coffers, though in fact it is difficult to be sure just how large a part fiscal exaction really played. The coins themselves give little away, while fines point to a situation in which the currency was not being completely replaced on a frequent basis, as might be expected if the tax system was truly dominant. So even if tax and expenditure did play a relatively larger role, and for longer than in Merovingian Gaul, for example, it should not be seen as accounting for the totality of circulation, even here. Okay, Iberia also brings up an important point in relation to this taxonomy of early medieval coin circulation, which is that it best applies to new and high value coins of gold and silver. These are the best known elements of the coinage, though not necessarily the only part. There were tiny fractional silver coins in early Merovingian Gaul and in Lombard North Italy. In Visigothic Iberia, there was an interesting series of small bronze issues from various large eastern and southern cities. These provided a parallel world of low-value currency that may have persisted into the later 7th century. Even more widespread was reuse of old Roman bronze coins. A revealing site in Spain is El Tolmo de Minateda, which is near Albacete in eastern Spain. This Roman hilltop settlement was abandoned in the 2nd century, then reoccupied between the 6th century and the 9th century. Extensive excavations on the site have yielded a large number of coins from the early medieval layers. These include a few Visigothic pieces, gold pieces, which occurred in the vicinity of the palace and the basilica, the church. But there were far, far more Roman bronze pieces, still from the early medieval layers, and these dated mostly to the 3rd and 4th centuries. And that's important because this was not an active Roman site at that time. These cannot have been found in situ. They've got to have been brought from somewhere else. Somebody found them in whatever other location and brought them to El Tolmo de Minateda to use in the early Middle Ages. On this hill in eastern Spain, there was a parallel world of low-value recycled coin that ran right through the early Middle Ages. Excavations of other sites in France and Italy have also identified prolonged circulation of Roman base metal coins widely into the 7th century and sometimes into the 11th century. Some of these later finds of Roman bronzes have been read as raw material for metal workers, though this is not always clear, and in any case, it does not preclude a second chance circulation beforehand. So it's distinctly possible that the lack of fresh, low-value coin was met with prolonged recycling of earlier currency, undercutting some of the limitations of earlier medieval coined money that I talked about before. But I would stress that this was an informal practice and probably rare after about 600. Moreover, it still begs the question of cui bono, who's benefiting from it. Somebody has to have dug up the relevant coins at some point. They cannot have been in continuous circulation. And as rights to treasure typically went with land ownership, access to Roman coins over time probably went more into the hands of landowners. Okay, my second model for coin circulation, thinking again mostly about the gold and silver stuff, is one in which minting and primary circulation remain the domain of the elite, but now with a wider reach of secondary circulation. Though this too would probably still only go a few steps beyond elite-led channels. That is to say, there was more coin and more use of it, just not really a larger autonomous sphere of secondary monetary circulation. Commercial use would be more significant than in the first model and may have amounted to about the sum of other uses put together. Carolingian Italy is a good example of this, not least because it illustrates how neighbouring regions, even within the same extended polity, could have quite different experiences in relation to their coinage. Italy at this time remains a bit of a puzzle. It had mint places turning out silver coins from 781 onwards, but there is a big difference between the fairly large representation of Italian coins outside the peninsula in what's now France, Belgium, Netherlands, places like that, and the still very meagre finds from within Italy itself. Simon Coupland and Alessia Rovelli are only the most recent of many scholars to look at this problem. Is the profile of finds from Italy representative? Not compared to England or the Netherlands, where there are big databases that bring together what's been found across the country, and they have relatively relaxed laws on metal detecting. Italy is not like that. Things are very tightly controlled. But the difference compared to the similarly restrictive regime in France is also substantial. I suspect there is rather more coming to light in Italy than ever gets recorded, but even so, there does seem to be a genuine break. Coin just didn't percolate out into local society in central and northern Italy as it did in some other parts of the Carolingian world or in contemporary England. This scenario reverses the usual expectation that local networks of exchange would be the basis of coin use. Within Italy, it is possible that patterns of local use remained based on those of the earlier gold period, with very little coin, which had seen very little coin use, while long distance ones, in an empire that did use silver pieces much more widely, took on a larger role. So in other words, the reason you don't see many silver coins being used in Italy is they still think of them as being used in the same way as gold ones. So it therefore makes sense for us to think about mechanisms that would remove coin in bulk from Italy and then parachute it into circulation at distant places beyond the Alps. That might well include merchants engaged in long-distance commerce, but also aristocrats and ecclesiastical houses with landed interests in Italy. In any case, this example shows two things. One is a good case study of the middling second model with some secondary circulation, but still in a framework dictated by those responsible for primary circulation. Second, it shows how important it is to allow for distinct characteristics of individual regions, periods. My third and final model for early medieval monetization sees the secondary sphere of circulation clearly eclipse the primary one. Uses of coin beyond their initial context of production would be extensive and distanced enough to create a distinct autonomous sphere. One good clue to a network of exchange on this scale is when references occur to monetized exchange between two non-elite figures, as for instance in a 9th century miracle collection relating to the shrine of St. Philibert at Noirmoutier on the west coast of France. Now, this describes how a throng of peasants would come for the holiness, but stay for the market, in which one of these peasants goes to a tavern and asks for a halfpenny's worth of wine from the landlord, although he only had a penny with which to pay. Flustered by the busy conditions in his bar, the landlord inadvertently gave the man a full penny's worth of wine, plus a halfpenny in change. He realized his mistake when the peasant came up for another round, saying, as I translated it here, "You must be having a laugh, mate. What you've got there is mine, not yours, as you took away both my wine and my money." The peasant swore by St. Philibert that he was telling the truth, and the offended saint inflicted prompt and messy retribution by having the peasant vomit all over the floor. Even in a society that ran on this model of monetization, primary circulation still mattered as the point of entry for everything that followed, and generally it was still in elite hands, albeit a wider cross-section of the elite than before. Expanding coin use across much of Western Europe from the late 10th century into the 11th accompanied growth of the minting network, not really to handle demand from below, because most of these new mints were small and did not contribute much to the overall circulating medium. Instead, they enabled local elites to tap into a new way of expressing superiority in local society. Some of the English and West Frankish makers of coin at this stage were drawn from lower ranks of the elite, what were called milites, basically proto-knights in France, or thanes in England, or their peers in wealth and status in other places. But the headline point is that there would now be a significantly larger layer of peasant coin use, non-elite coin use. And this would include not just free people, but also servile ones, slaves. It can be seen from texts like polyptychs, estate surveys, and anecdotes and miracle collections that peasants paying cash for their rent and then using markets to obtain the coins they needed to do that was completely standard. Technically, these three models that I've described could all work with similar volumes of coin, for we are talking more about the nature and intensity of use than strictly about the number in circulation, but in practice they generally correlated with expansion of the currency, visible from coin finds that mount up in number and spread out into the countryside. Interestingly, early medieval coins still tend not to turn up in settlement excavations, but rather from the land around them. A fourth model that we don't really see anywhere in early medieval Europe is when coin finds become commonplace in settlement excavations, suggesting frequent transactions within and between individual households, kind of thing you see with certain periods of Roman era, for example. And it only occurs after that in Western Europe when you get to about 1200 and after. In our period, we should probably imagine coins being available to peasants, even being kept in their homes, but only changing hands and therefore standing a chance of being lost in other settings, potentially more public ones like assemblies, markets, or rent payments, which is an argument recently put forward for French examples of these finds by Thibault Cardon. It is worth stressing that there was room for variation in how monetization implied by these models might work. Significant expansion would generally involve a commercial element. Written texts are clear on this, and it is difficult to see how wider distribution and reuse would be achieved otherwise, at least based on the information that we have. This is a very important point. Coins may not have called a complex market economy into being, but they did act like fingerprint powder for one, and probably helped stimulate them to some degree. And yet, they did not necessarily last. It might help to juxtapose here a last brief pair of examples. England in the age of bead from about 670 to 750, and then England and its neighbours in the late 10th and 11th centuries. On the face of it, going purely by the numbers on the two major databases for England and Wales, the earlier of these two periods was by far the more monetized, in that there are just a huge number of coins, far more coin finds. And relative to population, England may have been as monetized at this time as at any point down to the 17th century. But it is difficult to accept that there really was a commensurately larger, more articulated market economy at that time. The evidence from all sorts of historical and archaeological areas is much richer for the later 10th and 11th centuries, when the rise of coin use can be tied into the caging of the peasantry and the growth both of the lordly class and of seigneurial pressures on the rest of society, as well as the growth of markets and towns. We seem instead to be looking at a relatively short burst of enhanced monetization in the late 7th century, precipitated by a change in how elites handled and disposed of their precious metal wealth. This led to a short-term deluge of silver coin, which was apparently pumped downwards socially. There are precious few coin hoards from this period in England, France, or the Netherlands, hinting at circulation that favoured small-scale use, not one in which coins served a major role as a store of wealth. This might be a monetary system that ticks all the boxes of my third and most developed model, and it shows that societies of this period could absorb significant injections of coin, but in this case it was simply not as well embedded and supported as some later instances. I will wrap up there. The take-home point should be that although early medieval coined money was scarce and difficult to handle, it was nonetheless a lasting feature of the social and economic landscape, meaning that people did choose to make it and to use it. I've tried to sketch out some of the reasons why they did so, and the effects of introducing coin into any transaction. Does all of this amount to a monetary economy? I'd argue that yes, it did, one that worked in layers. Did everyone use cash as standard? Definitely no, although sometimes a more resounding no than at other times. Did a wide range of people use cash from time to time? Definitely yes, with a lot of interest in when and why they did so. Did most people think in terms of monetary units for exchange purposes? Again, a resounding yes. I'm reluctant to participate in the game of drawing arbitrary lines in the historical sand for what point or variable constituted a real money economy. A better approach is to allow for different kinds of money economy. Thank you.
Fantastic, Rory. I have to say that really is a brilliant synopsis of the book. I I have to say, having read the book and then reread it at a quick glance this morning through the notes, that you did a fantastic job here of providing an overview and synopsis of what is in the book. And I would certainly encourage all of you who are interested to pick the book up and read all of these aspects of what Rory discussed this afternoon in greater detail. I will just make a brief comment here that in your postscript to your conclusions, you mentioned that early medieval money has long been the victim of an inferiority complex, and I would say that you've done a great deal to rectify all of that with, this publication. We certainly have time to entertain a few questions if anybody has one. Ralph, I see that you have your hand up.
Yeah. Can you see me?
Cannot, but I can hear you.
Yeah.
There we
Oh,
are.
there
Okay.
we
Oh,
Yeah.
there you are.
Yeah. No, I couldn't wait to ask the question because I was so excited listening to this. I have to say, Rory, I just snapped up your book at Kalamazoo and I started reading it right away. So it was great. It was also really great to hear it in the flesh. I've got a kind of a sentimental attachment to silver, and you mentioned in your talk, silver made a few cameo appearances. You're mostly talking about gold, but it did turn up. For example, mentioned in the Merovingian Law Code, where in fact I've argued that denarius there isn't a reference to a coin. It is the weight mentioned in Isidore of Seville, right? And then you talked about the reuse of silver coins, and if you study coin hoards, and you've got all these silver coins that are worn down to nothing, like the Ropesdale hoard and things like this. And so, and another interesting thing you said that I guess I was interested to hear, that there was a gold-silver ratio by weight of about 12 to 14 to 1, which is remarkably similar to the Roman ratio.
Yeah.
And so that suggests that there is some kind of standard idea of the relative values of gold and silver. So anyway, with that long preamble, short question, could you maybe say a little bit more about what is going on with the silver in the background, and if there is any direct relationship between the gold and the silver?
I'd love to, Ralph. Yes, I'd say two things, I suppose. One of these is that in the late Roman period, and you're probably very well aware of this yourself, but I'm saying it for the benefit of all of us who are on, silver sort of switches back and forth in that sometimes it's basically seen as kind of like the gold. The gold is the measure against which everything else is judged. Money and wealth in the late Roman Empire is basically measured in terms of how much gold is it worth, and this tends to mean that other metals lose out. At certain points, silver works in that same way, and at other times, silver seems to work more like base metal. And this seems to correlate with periods when silver is hoarded in large amounts, and you see, for example, in immediately post-Roman Britain in the early 5th century, there's a huge number of hoards now deposited, mostly of silver, some of gold, but mostly of silver. And this brings me to the second thing I'd say, which is that in the very late Roman, well, you do have significant silver coinage in the Roman world. At certain points, you have these so-called siliqui that go into mostly the 4th and 5th centuries. You have some silver coinage in the Byzantine world, and especially in Ostrogothic Italy and Vandal Africa. But I think that you also see in the very late Roman and post-Roman period a lot of use of silver object and silver hack metal. There was a very good book that came out about this a few years ago in relation to Trap Rain Law Hoard from what's now Scotland, but with lots of good discussion about this phenomenon all over the Roman world. And I think that that's probably a major part of the way silver is being used. It's not always as coin. I think this is a really, really crucial point. One thinks of the Vikings as the experts in handling bullion, especially silver bullion, but it's not just them. I think that there's an awful lot of use of hack metal in late Roman world, post-Roman world, even to some extent in between. People do sometimes mention in Bede, for example, cutting up a silver dish to pass round the proceeds to individual poor people. So I think coin is, this is the numismatic society. We love coins, but they're not the only means of exchange or physical storage of wealth that's being used out there in relation to precious metal.
Oh, I'm very happy that you mentioned hack metal, because that allows me to put in a shameless plug for my my recent little book.
Oh, yes, which is a very, very good thing. Yes, I have a copy on my shelf.
Oh, bless your heart.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
You emphasize that a large amount of the economy operated without money, presumably some form of barter.
Without coin, yes.
Yeah, without coin, some form of barter. But nevertheless, at some point, they must intermingle. So what information is there on the value of coins in terms of goods, and how did it vary locally on supply demand, or were there certain standards that were maintained? I know often people talk about coins in terms of grains.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yes,
value.
You're absolutely correct. That the coins at this point, in terms of their weight, were measured by so many grains of wheat or barley, which of course is not a new thing. I mean, the whole reason we still talk about gold in terms of 24 carats is, Keratonia siliqua. It's the carob seeds that were used to measure gold coins in the late Roman world. So that, in principle, is not a new thing, but it does indicate a fundamental connection that there was seen between coins and seeds. There are certain authors, Isidore of Seville, a couple of others, who play on this idea of coins and seeds working together. In terms of barter, I think you're quite right. They had mechanisms of doing things that didn't involve coin. I'd prefer to use the word credit instead of barter, because barter is slightly tricky. That implies that I have a sheep, you have a chicken, and you want a chicken, and I want you want a sheep, and I want a chicken. The problem is, if you want a cow, we're stuck. This is something that Adam Smith already saw: double coincidence of wants, and that's why, in general, what's much better is if I give you, a sheep just now, and then at some later point, you will repay me with what I want. That seems to have been much more common, and it's now thought that that's probably the way money as we understand it starts. It's measures of obligation people have to each other, which start out in a very abstract way and then gradually get fixed into a physical form with something like silver or gold, and that then turns into coins that have a stamp to tell you who they come from. So yes, I think you're quite right. People are not always using coin, but when they're not using coin, they're most likely to be using credit. Prices. I wish I could say more about these, but unfortunately there is just vanishingly little information about prices from early medieval Europe. You get some anecdotal references to it. Unfortunately, these tend to be along the lines of, the famine was so terrible this year that the price of a measure of wheat got this high. Well, that doesn't actually tell you very much when they don't reveal what the normal price was, which doesn't tend to happen. You do get some legal sources, like the Charlemagne one I showed early on, which talk about prices or maximum prices, or sometimes the amount of compensation that is due if something is stolen. These are still not perfect, but they're the best evidence we've got. And what's interesting is that these seem to show that there is long-term stability in prices. Prices for sheep in England, for example, which are mentioned in some of these law codes, remain the same for at least 200 years. So it looks like there is very little long-term inflation. There are short-term spikes of inflation when there is a famine or something else like that, but by and large, it looks like prices remain fairly stable. And they're quite high. Like I mentioned at the start of this, an individual coin of gold or silver would buy you quite a lot.
All right. Well,
Thank you.
yeah, and thank you again. We are at the top of the hour, and I would once again like to thank Professor Naismith for a wonderful presentation today. And again, would encourage all of you, if you haven't already, to pick up his book. And one other plug for the book, I will say that Rory has a wonderful writing style, and I have to say that all throughout the book, I was as entertained by the words that he chose and his wordsmithing as I was by the subject matter itself. So congratulations again on your award-winning book, and thank you again for the presentation today.